December 2nd, 2000. Dear Franklin, I've settled myself down at a little coffee shop in Cheltenham, which is why this is handwritten. Then you were always able to decipher my spidery scrawl on postcards, since I gave you a terrible lot of practice. The couple at the next table over is having a knockdown drag over an application process for absentee ballots in Seminole County, the kind of can't pronounce that word that seems to consume the whole country right now. Since everyone around me has turned into a procedural pedant. At the same time, I bask in their heatedness as before a wood stove. My own apathy is bone-chilling. The Bagel Cafe is a homely establishment, and I don't think the waitress will mind if I nurse a cup of coffee by my legal pad. Cheltenham, too, is homey, authentic, with the kind of middle America quaintness that most well-to-do towns like Stockbridge and Lenox spend a great deal of money to fame. Its railroad station still receives trains. The commercial main drag sports and the traditional lineup of second-hand bookstores, full of those in Lauren Esselman novels you'd have hammered. Bakeries with burnt-edged bran muffins, charity consignment shops, a cinema whose marquee says theatre on the parochial presumption that the British spelling is more sophisticated, and a liquor store that, along with Taylor Magnums for the locals, stocks some surprisingly pricey Californian Zinfandies for out-of-towners. Manhattan residents with second homes keep this disheveled hamlet alive now that most local industries have closed. These summer folk and, of course, the new correctional facility on the outskirts of town. I was thinking about you on the drive up, that doesn't go without saying. By way of counterpoint, I was trying to picture the kind of man I'd assumed I'd end up with before we met. The vision was doubtless a composite of the on-the-road boyfriends you always wrote me about. Some of my romantic blow-ins were sweet, though whenever a woman described a man as sweet, the dalliance is doomed. If that assortment of cameo companions in Erles or Tel Aviv was anything to go by, sorry, the losers. I was destined to settle down with a stringy, cerebral type whose skittering metabolism burnt chickpea concoctions at a ferocious rate. Sharpened elbows, prominent Adam's apple, narrow wrists, a strict vegetarian, an anguish sort who reads Nietzsche and wears spectacles, alienated from his time and contemptuous of the automobile. An avid cyclist and a hill walker, professional marginalia, perhaps a potter, with a love of hardwoods and herb gardens, whose aspirations to an unpretentious life of physical toil, and lingering sun sets on a porch, are somewhere bellied by the steely, repressed rage which he pitches disappointing vases into an old drum, a weakness for breeding. An understated but ruthless sense of humor, a dry, distant laugh, back massages, recycling, sitar music, and a flirtation with Buddhism that is mercilessly behind him, vitamins and cribbage, water filters and French films, a pacifist with 3 guitars but no TV, an unpleasant association with team sports from a picked-on childhood, a hint of vulnerability, in the receding hairline at the temples, a soft, dark ponytail whispering down the spine, a sallow, olive complexion, almost sickly, tender, whispering sex, curious carved wooden talisman thonged around the neck that he will neither explain nor take off, even in the bath, diaries that I mustn't read, pasted up with 6 web clippings that illustrate what a terrible world we live in. Grisly find. Police found assorted bits of a man's body, including a pair of hands and 2 legs, in 6 luggage lockers in a Tokyo Central railway station. After inspecting all 2,500 coin lockers, police found a pair of buttocks in a black plastic garbage bag. A cynic about mainstream politics with an unabating ironic detachment from popular culture, and most of all, with fluent, if prettily accented English, a foreigner. We would live in the countryside, in Portugal or a little village in Central America, where a farm up the road would sell raw milk, fresh-turned sweet butter, and fat, seedy pumpkins. Our stone cottage would rive with creepers, its window boxes blushing red geraniums, and we would bake chewy rye and carrot brownies for our rustic neighbours. An overeducated man, My fantasy part would still root about the soil idly for the seeds of his own discontent, and surrounded by natural bounty, grow spitefully ascetic. Are you chuckling yet? Because then came along you, a big, broad meat-eater with brash blonde hair and ruddy skin that burns at the beaches, a bundle of appetites, a full, boisterous guffle, a man who tells knock-knock jokes, hot dogs, not even East 86th Street bratwurst, but meaty, greasy pig guts of that terrifying pink. Baseball, gimme caps, but puns and blockbuster movies, raw tap water and six-packs. A fearless, trusting consumer who only reads labels to make sure there are plenty of additives. A fan of the open road with a passion for his pickup who thinks bicycles are for nerds. Fucks hard and talks dirty. A private though unapologetic taste for porn. Mysteries, thrillers, and science fiction. A subscription to National Geographic. Barbecues on the 4th of July and intentions in the fullness of time to take up golf. Delights in crappy snack foods of every description. Burgles, curlies, cheesies, squiggles. You're laughing, but I don't eat them. Anything that looks less like food than packing material, and at least 6 degrees of separation from the farm. Bruce Springsteen, the early albums, cranked up high with the truck window down and your hair flying, sings along, off-key. How is it possible that I should be endeared by such tin air? Beach Boys, Elvis, never lose your roots. You did. Love the plain old rock and roll. Bombast. Though not impossibly stodgy, I remember, you took a shine to Pearl Jam, which was exactly when Kevin went off them. Sorry. It just had to be noisy. You hadn't any time for my Elgar, my Leo Kotke, though you made an exception for Aaron Copeland. You wiped your eyes briskly at Tanglewood as if to clear gnats, hoping I didn't notice that quiet city made you cry. And ordinary, obvious pleasures, the Bronx Zoo and Botanical Gardens, the Coney Island roller coaster, the Staten Island ferry, the Empire State Building. Though you were the only one New Yorker I'd ever met who'd actually taken the ferry to the Statue of Liberty. You dragged me along once. We were the only tourists on the boat who spoke English. Representational art, Edward Hopper, and my Lord Franklin, a Republican. A belief in the strong defense for otherwise small governments and low taxes. Physically, too, you were such a surprise. You yourself a strong defense. There were times you worried that I thought you were too heavy. I made so much of your size, though you weighed in at a pretty standard 165, 170, always battling those 5 pounds worth of cheddar widgets that would settle on your belt. But to me you were enormous, so sturdy and solid, so wide, so thick. None of that delicate, wristy business of my imaginings. Built like an oak tree, against which I could pitch my pillow and read, mornings I could curl into the crook of your branches. How lucky we were when we were spared what we think we want. How weary I might have grown of all those silly pots and fussy diets, and how I detest the whine of sitar music. The biggest surprise of all is that I married an American. Not just any American either, a man who happened to be American. No, you were American by choice as well as by birth. You are in fact a patriot. I had never met one before. Rubes, yes, blind, untravelled, ignorant people who thought the United States was the whole world. So to say anything against it was like decreeing the universe or air. Instead, you'd been to a few places, Mexico, one disastrous trip to Italy with a woman whose cornucopia of allergies included tomatoes. And you decided you'd liked your own country. No, you loved your own country, its smoothness and efficiency, its practicality, its broad, unpretentious accents and emphasis on honesty. I did say that you were enamored of an archaic version of the US, either then America that was long lost in the past or never was, that you were enamored by the idea. And you did say that the part of the America was an idea. That was more than most countries could claim, which were most scrappy paths and circumstations on a map. It was fine, it was a beautiful idea too, you said. And you pointed out, I granted you this, that a nation that aimed to preserve above or the ability of its citizens to do pretty much whatever it wanted, was exactly the sort of place that should have captivated the likes of me. But it hadn't worked out that way. I'd object and you'd counter. Better than anywhere else. We would be off. It is true that I grew disenchanted, but I'd still like to thank you for introducing me to my own country. Wasn't that how we'd met? I decided at AWAP to run those advertisements in Mother Jones and Rolling Stones. When I was vague about the photos you wanted, Young and Rubicam had to stop in. You showed up to my office in a flannel shirt and dusty jeans, a beguiling impertinence. I tried so hard to be professional because your shoulders were distracting. France, I suppose, and the Rhone Valley. And then I dithered over the expenses, sending you over, putting you up. You laughed. Don't be ridiculous, you just made. I can find you a Rhone Valley in Pennsylvania, which indeed you did do. Hitherto, I'd always regarded the United States as a place to leave. After you brazenly asked me out, an executive with whom you had a business relationship, you goaded me to admit that I had been born elsewhere. The US of A was perhaps the first country that I would make a beeline to visit. Whatever I might think of it, the place that called the shots and pulled the strings, that made the movies and sold Coca-Cola and shipped Star Trek all the way to Java, the center of the action, a country that you needed a relationship with, even if that relationship was hostile, a country that demanded, if not accepted, at least rejection, anything but neglect, the country and every other country's face, that would visit you whether you liked it or not, almost anywhere on the planet. Okay, I protested. Okay, I would visit. So I visited. In those early days, remembering your recurrent astonishment that I had never been to a baseball game, or Yellowstone, or the Grand Canyon. I sneered at them and had never eaten a McDonald's hot apple pie. I confess I liked it. Some days you observed there would be no McDonald's. Just because there are lots of them doesn't mean that hot apple pies aren't excellent, or that it isn't a privilege to live in a time where you can buy them for 99 cents. This was one of your favourite themes, that profession, replication, and popularity wasn't necessarily devaluing, and that time itself made all things rare. You loved to savour the present tense, and were more conscious than anyone I've ever met that every constitute is fleeting. And that was your perspective on the country as well, that it was not forever, that of course it was an empire, though it was nothing to be ashamed of. History was made of empires, and the United States was far away the greatest, richest, and fairest empire that had ever dominated the earth. Inevitably, it would fall. Empires always did, but we were lucky, you said. You got to participate in the most fascinating social experiment ever attempted. Sure, it was imperfect, you would add, with the same hastiness which I observed before Kevin was born, that of course some children had problems. But you would say if the US were to fall, or founder during your lifetime, collapse economically, be overrun by an aggressor, or corrupt from within by something vicious, you would weep. I believe you would. But sometimes consider during those days you were carting me off to the Smithsonian, needing me to recite the presidents in order, grilling me on the causes of the Haymarket riots. But I wasn't visiting the country quite. I was visiting your country, the one you had made for yourself, the way a child constructs a log cabin out of popsicle sticks. It was a lovely reproduction, too. Even now, when I glimpse snippets of the preamble to the Constitution, we, the people, the hair rises on the back of my neck, because I hear your voice. The Declaration of Independence, we hold these truths. Your voice. Irony. I've thought about you in irony. It's always got up your back when my friends from Europe would come through and dismiss our countrymen as having no sense of irony, yet, ironically, in the latter 20th century, irony was huge in the US, painfully so. In fact, I was so sick of it, though I didn't realize until we met. Coming into the 80s, everything was retro, and therefore there was an undercurrent of snideness, a distancing in all those 50 diners with chrome stools and oversized root beer floats. Irony means at once having and not having. Irony involves a prissy dabbling, a disavowal. We had friends whose apartments were completely tricked out in sardonic kitsch. Piccini dolls, framed advertisements for Kellogg's cornflakes from the 20s. Look at the ballfuls go. Who owned nothing that wasn't a joke. You wouldn't live that way. Oh, to have no sense of irony was supposed to not know what it was, to be a moron, to have no sense of humour. And yet you knew what it was. You laughed a little at the lamp-bearing cast-iron black jockey the bellman picked up for their hearth to be polite. You got the joke. You just didn't think it was funny, really, and in your own life you wanted objects that were truly beautiful and not a laugh. Such a bright man. You were sincere by design and not merely by nature. American by personal fiat, and you would embrace all that was good in it. Is it called naivete when you are naive on purpose? You would go on picnics. You would take conventional vacations to national monuments. You would sing Over the Land of the Free at the top of your tuneless voice at the Mets game, and never with a smirk. The United States, you claimed, was one existential cutting edge. It was on the It was a country whose prosperity was without precedent, where virtually everyone had enough to eat. A country that strove for justice and offered up nearly every entertaining thing and sport, every religion, ethnicity, occupation, and political affiliation to be had, with a wild wealth of landscapes, over flora to fauna to weather. It was not possible to have a fine, rich, scrumptious life in this country, with a beautiful wife and a healthy, growing boy. Then it wasn't possible anywhere. And even now I believe that you may be right, but that it may not be possible anywhere. "9 p.m. Back home. The waitress was tolerant, but the bagel cafe was closing. And printouts may be impersonal, but it's easier on the eye. For that matter, I worry that throughout the handwritten passage you've been skimming, reading ahead, I worry the instant you spotted Cheltenham up top you could think of nothing else. That for once you couldn't care less about my feelings for the United States. Cheltenham? I go to Cheltenham? I do, I go at every opportunity. Fortunately, these journeys every 2 weeks to Claverack Juvenile Correction Facility are aimed at such a restrictive window of visiting hours that I'm not free to consider going an hour later or another day. I leave at exactly 11:30 because it is the first Saturday of the month and I must arrive immediately after the second lunch slot at 2 p.m. I do not indulge myself in reflection over how much I dread going to see him, or more improbably look forward to it. I just go. You're astonished. You shouldn't be. He's my son too, and a mother should visit her child in prison. I have no ends of failings as a mother, but I've always followed the rules. If anything, following the letter of unwritten parental law was one of my failings. That came out in the trial, the civil suit. I was appalled at how upstanding I looked on paper. Vince Mancini, Mary's lawyer, accused me in court of visiting my son so dutifully in his detention center during his own trial only because I anticipated being sued for parental negligence. I was acting a part, he claimed, going through the motions. Of course, the trouble with jurisprudence is that it cannot accommodate subtleties. Mancini was onto something. There may indeed be an element of theatre in these events, but they continue when no one is watching, because if I am trying to prove to myself that I am a good mother, I am proving this dismally, as it happens, to myself. Kevin himself had been surprised by my dogged appearance, which is not to say, in the beginning at least, pleased. Back in 1999, at 16, he was still the same. He was still at that age when to be seen with your mother was embarrassing. How bittersweetly these truisms about teenagers persist through the most adult of troubles. In those first few visits, he seemed to regard my very presence as an accusation. So before I said a single word, he'd get angry, but it didn't seem sensible that he should be the one who was mad at me. But in the same vein, when a car nearly sideswipes me in a crosswalk, I noticed that the driver is frequently furious, shouting, gesticulating, cursing at me, who he nearly ran over and who had the undisputed right of way. This is a dynamic particular to encounters with male drivers who seem to grow all the more indignant the more completely wrong they are. I think the emotional reasoning, if you can call it that, is transitive. You may feel bad, feeling bad makes me mad, ergo, you make me mad. If I had the presence back then to seize on the first part of that proof, I might have a glimpse in Kevin's instantaneous dungeon, a glimmer of hope. But at the time, his fury simply mystified me. It seemed so unfair. Women tend more towards chagrin, and not only in traffic, So I blamed me, and he blamed me. I felt ganged up on. Hence, when he was first incarcerated, we didn't have a conversation as such. Simply being in front of him made me limp. He sapped me of even the energy to cry, which anyway would not have been very productive. After 5 minutes, I might ask, my voice hoarse, about the food. He would gawk at me incredulously, as if under any circumstance the inquiry were as inane as it actually was. Or I'd ask, are they treating you all right? Although I wasn't sure what that meant, or either whether I wanted his minders to treat him all right. He'd slur that, sure, they kiss me buddy boy every night. It didn't take long for me to run out of perform mummy questions, for which I think we were both relieved. If it took little time to get past my posing as a loyal mother, who's only concerned that Sonny's eating his vegetables, we are still contending with Kevin's more impenetrable pose as a sociopath who's beyond reach. The trouble is, while my role as a mother who stands by her son no matter what is ultimately demanding, it is mindless, irrational, blind, and sappy, hence the part I might gratefully shed. Kevin gets too much sustenance from his own cliché to let it go quietly. He still seems intent on demonstrating to me that he may have been a subjugant in my house who has to clean his plate, but now he's a celebrity who's been on the cover of Newsweek. His fricative appeal to the collection, Kevin Cachadorian, or KK to the tabloids, like Kenneth Gwanda in Zambia, has just chidingly of every major network news anchor's tongue. He'd even had a hand in setting the national agenda, sparking new calls for corporal punishment, juvenile death sentences, and the V-chip. In lockup, he would have me know that he's no tin horn delinquent, but a notorious fiend of whom his less accomplished fellow juveniles are in awe. Once in those early days, after he'd grown more talkative, I asked him, how do they regard you, the other boys? Are they critical of what you did? This is as close as I could come to asking, do they trip you in the hallways or hawk in your soup? At first, you see, I was hesitant, deferential. He'd physically frightened me, and I was desperate not to set him off. There were prison guards nearby, of course, but they had been security protocol in his high school. Police in Gladstone, and what good had they been? I never feel protected anymore. Kevin honked. That hard, joyless laugh forced through his nose and said something like, Are you kidding? They fucking worship me, Mumsy. There's not a Duke in this joint who hasn't taken out 50 dickheads in a peer group before breakfast in his head. I'm the only one with the stones to do it in real life. Whenever Kevin cites real life, it is with excessive firmness of which fundamentalists reference hell or heaven, as if he's trying to talk to himself into something. I'd only his word, of course, but that far from being shunned, Kevin had achieved the status of mythic proportion amongst hoods who'd merely hijacked cars or knifed rival drug dealers. But I'd come to believe he must have at once garnered some prestige, since, in his oblique fashion, just this afternoon he allowed that had begun to ebb. He said, Tell you what, I'm fucking tired of telling you the same story. From which I could infer that his fellow inmates were tired of hearing it. Over 1.5 years is a long time for teenagers, and Kevin is already yesterday's news. He's getting old enough to appreciate it too. But one of the differences between a perp, as they say in cop shows, and your average newspaper reader is the onlookers are allowed the luxury of getting fucking tired of the same fucking story, and are free to move on. Culprits are stuck in what must be a tyrannical rehearsal of the same old tale. Kevin will be climbing the stairs to the aerobics conditioning alcove at the Gladstone High School gym for the rest of his life. So he is resentful, and I don't blame him for being bored with his own atrocity, or for envying others who, in their capacity to abandon it. Today he went on to grass about some pipsqueak, new arrival at the Clavernack, who was only 13. Kevin added for my benefit, his cock's the size of a tootsie-roll, the little ones, you know. Kevin wiggled his pinky. Three for a quarter. With relish, Kevin explained the boy's claim to fame. An elderly couple in an adjacent apartment had complained about how loudly he played his CDs of the Monkees at 3 a.m. The next weekend, the couple's daughter discovered her parents in their bed, slit from crotch to throat. That's appalling, I said. I can't believe someone still listens to the monkeys. I earned a begrudging snort. He went on to explain that police have never found the entrails, which is the detail on which the media, not to mention the boys' overnight Clavenack fan club, had seized. Your friend's precocious. The missing entrails. Didn't you teach me that to get notice in this business you have to add a twist? Maybe horrified Franklin, but it's taken me the better part of 2 years to get this far with him, and our black, straight-faced banter passes for progress. But Kevin is still not comfortable with my gaminess. I usurp his lines. I'd made him jealous. I don't think he's so smart, Kevin said aloofly. Probably just looked down at those guts and thought, cool, free sausages. Kevin shot me a furtive glance. My impassivity was clearly a disappointment. Everyone around here thinks that twerp's so tough, Kevin resumed. All like, man, you can play like sounding music loud as you want, I ain't saying nothing. His African-American accent had become quite accomplished, and he'd made inroads into it his own. But I'm not impressed. He's just a kid, too little to know what he was doing. And you weren't? I asked sharply. Kevin folded his arms and looked satisfied. I'd gone back to playing mother. I knew exactly what I was doing. He leaned onto his elbows, and I'd do it again. I can see why, I said primly, gesturing to the windowless room whose walls were painted in vermilion and chartreuse. I have no idea why they decorated prisons like a romper room. It's worked out so well for you. Just swapped one shithole for another. He waved his right hand with its 2 extended fingers in a manner that portrayed he'd taken up smoking. Worked out well. Subject closed, as usual. Still, I made the note of the fact this 13-year-old parvenu stealing the Clavenack limonite aggrieved our son. It seemed that you and I needn't have worried about his death of ambition. As to my parting with him today, I had thought to leave it out. But what is it what I would like to withhold from you that I may need to most include? The guard with a mud spatter of facial moles who called time. For once we had used the full hour without spending most of it staring at the clock. We were standing on either side of the table, and I was able to mumble in some filler line like I'll see you in 2 weeks, when I realized Kevin had been staring straight at me, whereas his every other glance had been sidelong. This stopped me, unnerved me, made me wonder why I'd ever wanted him to look me in the eye. Once I was no longer fussing with my coat, he said, You may be fooling the neighbours and the guards and Jesus and your gaga mother with these goody two-shoes visits of yours, but you're not fooling me. Keep it up if you want a gold star, but don't be dragging your ass back here on my account. Then he added, because I hate you. I know children say that all the time, in fits. I hate you, eyes squeezed with tears, but Kevin is approaching 18 and his delivery was flat. I had some idea of what I was supposed to say back. Now, I know you don't mean it, when I knew he did, or I love you anyway, young man, like it or not. But I had an inkling that it was following just these pat scripts that had helped me land in a garish, overheated room that smelled like a bus toilet on an otherwise lovely, unusually clement December afternoon. So I said instead, in the same informal, informational tone, I often hate you too, Kevin, and turned heel. So you can see why I needed a pick-me-up coffee. It was an effort to resist the bar. Driving home, I was reflecting on however much I might wish to eschew a country whose citizens, when encouraged to do pretty much whatever they want, eviscerate the elderly, and it made perfect sense that I would marry another American. I had better reason than most to find foreigners passé, having penetrated their exoticism, to the chopped liver that they are to one another. Besides, by the time I was 33, I was tired, suffering with the cumulative exhaustion of standing all day that you could only register when you sit down. I was forever myself a foreigner, feverishly rehearsing a phrasebook Italian for basket of bread. Even in England, I had to remember to say pavement instead of sidewalk. Conscious that I was an ambassador of sorts, I would defy the daily barrage of hostile preconceptions, taking care not to be arrogant, pushy, ignorant, presumptuous, crass, or loud in public. But I had arrogated to myself the whole planet as my personal backyard. and this very affrontly marked me as hopelessly American, as did the fanciful notion that I could remake myself into a tropical internationalist hybrid from the horribly specific origins of Racine, Wisconsin. Even the carelessness with which I abandoned my native land was classically a piece which our nosely restless, aggressive people, who all, save you, complacently assume that America is a permanent fixture. Europeans are better clued. They know about their liveliness, the contemporariness of history, its immediate rapacities, will often rush back to tend to their own perishable gardens to make sure that Denmark, say, is still there. But to those of us whom invasion is exclusively associated with outer space, our country is an unassailable bedrock which will wait indefinitely intact for our return. Indeed, I had explained my thoughts on this more than once to foreigners, as facilitated by my perception that the US states the US doesn't need me. It's embarrassing to pick up your life partner according to what the televisions you watch as a child, but in a way that's exactly what I did. I wanted to describe some wiry, ineffectual little man as Barney Fife, without having to tortuously apprehend a pen that Barney was a character in a warm, rarely exported serial called The Andy Griffith Show, in which an incompetent deputy was always getting into trouble by the dint of his own hubris. I wanted to be able to hum the theme song from The Honeymooners and have you chime in with how sweet it is. And I wanted to be able to say that came out of left field and not kick myself that baseball images didn't necessarily scan abroad. I wanted to stop having to pretend I was a cultural freak with no customs of my own, to have a house that itself had rules about shoes, to which its visitors must conform. You restored me to the concept of home. Home is precisely what Kevin had taken from me. My neighbours now regard me with the same suspicion they reserve for illegal immigrants. They grope for words, speak to me with exaggerated deliberation, as if a woman for whom English is a second language. And since I have been exiled to this Raphael class, a mother of one of those Columbine boys, I, too, grope for words, not sure how to translate my off-world thoughts into the language of 2 for the price of 1 sales and parking tickets. Kevin has turned me into a foreigner again in my own country. And maybe this helps to explain why these bi-weekly Saturday visits, because it is only at Clavenack Correctional Facility that I need not translate my alien argot into the language of the suburban mundane. It is only at Clavenack Correctional that we can make allusions without explanations, that we can take as understood a shared cultural past. And that is the end of that chapter.